You open your phone right now and you can search almost anything ever written, every book, every idea, every argument humans have ever had with each other. It takes you 3 seconds, you do not think about it. But 2,000 years ago, humanity built something like that once before, and then it disappeared. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic fire. It disappeared slowly, quietly, over centuries, until almost nobody noticed it was gone. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria, and the real story is far stranger than the one you were taught. You were probably told it burned. One fire, one villain, Julius Caesar, or maybe a mob, or maybe religious extremists centuries later. Pick your version. Every telling has a single dramatic blaze that destroys everything in an afternoon. It is a satisfying story. It has a beginning, a climax, an ending. History rarely works that way. What if there was no single fire at all? What if the truth is something slower and something far more familiar to you? Let's go back to the beginning. Around 300 BCE, a new city rises on the Egyptian coast. Alexander the Great is dead. His generals split his empire between them. One of them, Ptolemy, takes Egypt. He inherits a city named after his old commander, sitting at the edge of the Mediterranean, and he wants it to become something the world has never seen. Not just a capital, a machine for collecting all human knowledge. He builds the Mausion. Think of it less like a library and more like the world's first research university, funded entirely by the state. Scholars live there for free. They eat there for free. Their only job is to think, to write, to translate, to argue. Attached to it is the library itself, a building meant to hold every scroll that had ever mattered to anyone, anywhere. And Ptolemy does not ask nicely for those scrolls. Every ship that docks in Alexandria's harbor gets searched. If a scroll is found on board, it gets confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and the copy is handed back to the original owner. The original stays in Alexandria. Historians call these the ship copies, and they were not polite requests. They were closer to intellectual custom seizures at a scale no city had ever attempted. Ask yourself something. Why would an empire go to that much trouble? Why would a king spend a fortune confiscating scrolls from merchant ships instead of just taxing grain and moving on? Because Ptolemy understood something that still holds true today. Whoever holds the knowledge holds the power. Information was not a luxury to him. It was a weapon, a currency, and a monument all at once. At its peak, estimates put the library's holdings somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. To translate that into something your brain can actually picture, a single scroll usually held what we would now call one chapter of a book. So this was not a library with a few 100,000 books on the shelf. This was closer to a library holding the equivalent of tens of thousands of full modern books, hand-copied, one at a time, by scribes working generation after generation. Here is where the story gets stranger than the myth. Historian Bart Ehrman, along with classicists who have spent careers studying the ancient book trade, has pointed out something the popular story conveniently skips. There likely was no single catastrophic fire that ended it all. There were several fires across several centuries, hitting different buildings, different collections, different moments in a slow decline. The first fire happened in 48 BCE. Julius Caesar was in Alexandria, caught in a civil war with the Egyptian court, and he ordered his own ships in the harbor set ablaze to stop them falling into enemy hands. The fire spread. It reached the docks. Some ancient sources say it reached warehouses near the harbor that were storing scrolls, possibly overflow from the main library, possibly scrolls waiting to be shipped out for copying elsewhere. Even ancient writers disagreed about how much was actually lost that day. Some say it was catastrophic. Others say it was a portion of the collection, not the whole thing. So the library survived Caesar. It kept functioning for centuries afterward. Scholars kept working there. That alone should make you pause. If the Great Fire happened in 48 BCE, why do we have records of philosophers studying at Alexandria more than 200 years later? The decline that actually mattered was not a single afternoon. It was funding. Under the Ptolemaic kings, the library had a mission and a budget. Rome eventually absorbed Egypt as a province, and Roman administrators did not have the same obsessive devotion to Ptolemy's original vision. Funding tightened, fewer new scrolls were acquired, fewer new copies were made to replace scrolls that naturally decayed, because papyrus does not last forever no matter how carefully you store it. A library is not a vault. It is a living organism that requires constant new inputs, constant maintenance, constant institutional will. Take that away slowly and the collection does not explode, it simply erodes. Then in 270 CE, a different kind of violence arrived. The Roman Emperor Aurelian was putting down a rebellion inside Alexandria itself, led by the breakaway Palmyrene Empire. The fighting in the city was brutal, and ancient sources describe significant destruction in the royal quarter of Alexandria, the very neighborhood where the original Mausion and library complex stood. This is considered by many historians, including classicist Roger Bagnall, to be one of the most damaging blows the original institution ever suffered. Not because of book burning as an ideological act, but because of urban warfare that happened to burn through a neighborhood that held irreplaceable scrolls. By this point, you should be noticing a pattern. Every major loss connects to a war, a siege, or a political collapse that had nothing to do with books at all. Nobody set out that day to destroy human knowledge. Knowledge simply happened to be sitting in a city that kept getting fought over. There is a second library people forget entirely, a daughter institution called the Serapeum, built as a temple complex that also housed an overflow collection of scrolls, a kind of backup archive for the main library. In 391 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued a decree ordering the destruction of pagan temples across the empire as part of a broader campaign to enforce Christianity as the state religion. The Serapeum, still standing as a temple to the god Serapis, was targeted and destroyed by a Christian mob, reportedly led by the bishop Theophilus. This is a real, well-documented event, and it likely did destroy whatever scrolls remained inside at that late date. But notice something important. By 391 CE, the original Great Library founded by Ptolemy had already been in decline for over 200 years. What burned at the Serapeum was a shadow of what once existed, not the peak collection from centuries earlier. The final blow landed on something that had already been fading for generations. So which version is true? All of them partially and none of them completely. Caesar's fire, Aurelian's war, Theodosius's religious purge. Each one took a bite out of an institution that was already shrinking under the much slower, much less dramatic pressure of reduced funding and natural decay. The single villain story survives because your brain, like every human brain, prefers one clean cause to a messy truth spread across 4 centuries. Researcher Roger S. Bagnall has argued the single catastrophic fire myth persists largely because it makes for better storytelling than the truth, and ancient historians themselves, writing centuries after the events, often compressed a long decline into one dramatic scene for their own readers. Now ask yourself the real question behind this entire video. What if none of it had ever burned? What if Alexandria's library had simply kept its funding, kept its scribes, kept copying scrolls generation after generation, all the way into the modern era? Think about what was actually lost. We know the names of plays by Sophocles and Euripides that existed as complete works in that library and now survive only as fragments or as titles mentioned in other surviving texts. We know astronomers there were already calculating the size of the Earth with startling accuracy, centuries before anyone in Europe would attempt it again. Eratosthenes, the library's chief librarian for a time, measured the Earth's circumference using nothing but the angle of shadows in 2 different cities and got remarkably close to the correct number. That knowledge sat in Alexandria. Some of it survived by luck, copied and recopied across the centuries by Islamic scholars during the medieval period, who preserved huge portions of Greek science and philosophy that would otherwise have vanished from human memory entirely. Some of it did not survive at all, Here is the modern mirror, the part of this story that should feel uncomfortably familiar. You live in an age that is also building the largest information archive humanity has ever attempted. Servers instead of scrolls, data centers instead of the mouse-yawn, and just like Alexandria, that archive is not indestructible. It depends entirely on continued funding, continued maintenance, continued institutional will to keep copying, migrating, and preserving information as formats change and old storage decays. Digital archivists today have a name for exactly the same phenomenon that killed Alexandria slowly instead of quickly. They call it digital rot when files become unreadable not because of a fire, but because nobody bothered to migrate them to new formats before the old ones became obsolete. You assume your knowledge is permanent because it is instant. Alexandria assumed the same thing, a city that could search almost anything ever written in its own way, just as you can now with your phone in your hand. And it still slipped away, not in one afternoon, but one underfunded decade at a time. Let's slow down on Eratosthenes for a moment, because his story tells you exactly what kind of place Alexandria actually was. He was not a specialist locked away in one narrow field. He was chief librarian, yes, but also a mathematician, a geographer, a poet, and an astronomer all at once. His colleagues nicknamed him Beta, second best, because he was remarkably good at almost everything but never the single greatest at any one thing. That nickname was not really an insult. It was a description of exactly the kind of mind Alexandria was built to cultivate. A place where a person could wander freely between subjects because the scrolls covering every field imaginable were sitting one room away from each other. Think about how strange that actually is. Somewhere in that same building, medical scholars were performing systematic human dissections, something that would not be openly practiced again in much of the world for well over 1,000 years afterward. Herophilus, working in Alexandria, mapped the nervous system and distinguished it from the blood vessels, correctly identifying the brain, not the heart, as the seat of thought. That single insight took centuries to fully reestablish once Alexandria's institutional momentum faded. You live in a world where that fact feels almost too obvious to mention. Of course the brain thinks. Of course. But someone had to discover that, prove it, write it down, and then that written proof had to survive long enough for the rest of civilization to catch up to it again. Now picture the scribes themselves, the people almost nobody remembers by name. Alexandria did not just collect scrolls. It employed teams of trained copyists whose entire careers were spent transcribing worn, decaying papyrus onto fresh sheets before the originals crumbled into dust. Papyrus, remember, is a plant fiber. It is not stone. It does not last centuries sitting untouched on a shelf in a humid Mediterranean climate. Every single scroll in that collection had an expiration date built into its material, and the only thing standing between that scroll and permanent loss was a scribe with a steady hand and enough funding to keep working. This is the detail almost every retelling skips entirely. The library was never a vault of finished, static objects. It was a factory that had to keep running every single day forever, or the collection would simply dissolve on its own, no fire required. That is what actually changed under Roman administration. It was not a decree banning knowledge. Nobody stood up and announced the end of scholarship in Alexandria. Instead, budgets for new scribes quietly shrank. Positions went unfilled when an aging copyist retired or died. Fewer new acquisitions arrived from merchant ships because the aggressive confiscation policy that built the original collection had softened generations earlier under different rulers with different priorities. A library that once expanded by force now simply held steady, and a collection that only holds steady against a backdrop of constant material decay is a collection that is already shrinking, even if nobody in the building notices day to day. This is the part historians like Bagnall keep returning to, because it complicates the version of history most people find satisfying. There is no villain to point at in a slow funding decline. There is no single scene you could put in a film, no torch thrown through a window. Just quieter budget meetings, generation after generation, each one slightly less generous than the last, until the scrolls simply outlive the will to keep copying them. Now think about what this actually cost the world in ways you can still feel today. We know Sophocles wrote well over 100 plays across his lifetime. 7 survive complete. We know this because other ancient writers, working from copies that once existed inside libraries like Alexandria's, occasionally quoted a line here, described a plot there, or listed a title in a catalog. The rest are gone, not because a mob decided Sophocles was dangerous, but because nobody kept recopying those scrolls once the material started to decay and nobody replaced them in time. Some of what Alexandria preserved did make it through, but often along a route you were probably never taught in school. During the medieval period, while much of Western Europe drifted away from systematic study of Greek science, scholars working in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba translated, copied, and expanded on Greek texts that had survived through exactly this kind of institutional lineage. Thinkers like Al-Kindi and Ibn al-Haytham built directly on Greek optics, mathematics, and astronomy that had been preserved, argued over, and refined for centuries in cities connected to Alexandria's original scholarly network. When those Arabic translations eventually filtered back into Europe centuries later, they helped ignite what historians now call the beginning of the Renaissance. In other words, some fragments of Alexandria's original mission did not vanish. They simply took the long way home through a different language, across a different continent, carried by people who understood exactly how fragile a collection of knowledge actually is. Now bring this back to you, sitting wherever you are right now, holding a device that can summon nearly the entire written record of human civilization in under a second. It feels permanent. It feels like it could never possibly disappear. Alexandria's scholars almost certainly felt the exact same way, standing in a building holding hundreds of thousands of scrolls, in the largest, wealthiest, most intellectually dominant city in the ancient Mediterranean world. Permanence is not actually a property of information. It never has been. It is a property of continued human attention. Digital preservation specialists today describe something they call link rot and format obsolescence, and it is worth pausing on how eerily close that language sounds to what happened in Alexandria. Files saved in formats that software companies eventually stop supporting. Hard drives that physically degrade after a decade or two, sitting quietly in a server room, waiting for someone to notice before the data becomes unreadable. Entire archives of early web pages, early video game code, early digital art, already lost simply because nobody migrated the files forward before the storage medium failed. It is not a dramatic fire. It is a slow, invisible erosion, exactly like the one that hollowed out Alexandria's collection 2,000 years before servers existed. So tonight, when you open your phone and search something in 3 seconds without a second thought, remember that permanence was never really about the scrolls, or the fire, or the servers. It was always about whether anyone kept paying attention long enough to keep copying the truth forward. The real answer, it turns out, was never a single blaze at all. It was silence spread out over 400 years, one budget cut at a time.